This is a story that's very interesting, and when you hear it unfold, it makes a lot of sense. Upsetting when you break it all down. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the UFC and Zuffa lawsuit, the antitrust lawsuit, and what it all means. So I just heard an interview. Hey, what's going on, fight fans? Hey, this is Coach D, the Wild Man, coming at you again with another episode of Coach D Media, where I talk about all things combat related, from mixed martial arts on to whatever. Today, I'm embarking on unfamiliar territory, so I'm gonna kind of be loose with it. But this is a story that's very interesting, and when you hear it unfold, it makes a lot of sense. Upsetting when you break it all down. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the UFC and Zuffa lawsuit, the antitrust lawsuit, and what it all means. So I just heard an interview with Jon Fitch, and he kind of breaks it down in layman terms of what really is the problem. You know, it's not just about fighter pay and unfair treatment. It's all of it, and what it all means to the average fighter, right? So we have to go back way back when UFC first started, when it was bought by Dana White and the Fertitta brothers, and then they went ahead and started putting all this money behind building the brand and all that kind of good stuff. Of course, as fans, we were excited. We're like, man, this is going to be dope. We get to watch some good fights, yada, yada, yada. Because back then you had WEC was operating. You had Pride was operating, IFL, Strike Force. We had all these other, promotions that were around too that we were watching as well. So we weren't just watching the UFC. We were watching all these other MMA promotions as well. I was a huge fan of Pride. And I was a huge fan of WEC. So when the UFC came on board and they had all this money, backing them eventually, and they started opening up more doors, getting more freedom to broadcast in different states. They started pushing the pace and getting UFC out there. Right. So as a fan, I'm like, great. We get to see, a lot of great fights. So what they do next? They started buying up all these other promotions. So they bought World Fighting Alliance. They bought them. Then they bought WEC, World Extreme Cage Fighting. Then they bought Pride. Then they bought International Fight League. And then they bought Strike Force. Right? You're like, okay, well, put it all under one umbrella. How bad could it be? Right. So this is what we're thinking as fans. Right. But now when you see Jon Fitch break it down, right, and explain what happened with all this, you're like, okay, that's kind of effed up. Right. So let's look at who are some of the people that were in this lawsuit. Who were the ones that kicked it off? Right. So Kung Lee, he was one of the ones to get this ball rolling. Nate Quarry, you remember that. Jon Fitch, you remember him. Brandon Vera, Luis Vasquez, I don't know who he is. Kyle Kingsbury, I'm not really sure who he is. So these are kind of all the original fighters that kind of got this, lawsuit kicked off, and then listening to Jon Fitch kind of break it down. You like, okay, I see why it's a problem, right? So we're always saying fighters pay, right? That's what we always say. We always say, look, got to pay fighters more, right? But the UFC wasn't having that. They go, look, you're under contract. We're not paying you more. But they make everything sound so good. You figure out, hey, if you keep on fighting, you'll eventually make more money. That's the story that's been told. The more you fight, the more you win, the more opportunities. Look at all the fighters that are winning now, which we'll go to in a minute. So how Jon Fitch brought it down, he said the way it unfolded is when you got into the UFC, right? And you first signed your original contract, they said, hey, this is how you're going to start. The more you win, your pay will go up, right? But it was hard for your pay to go up. So you weren't making a whole bunch of money starting off, right? And you had to be this breakout star for you to get anything. As long as you were under contract, what you sign is what you get, okay? So now when the UFC started to grow, what they do, they started taking away sponsorships. So now you couldn't get any outside sponsor money, right? So the only place you're going to get paid from is the UFC because you're under contract. So you can't make money no other place than the UFC, okay? So then if you keep on rising, eventually you get a couple dollars more, right? And then if you get the title, now you are a belt holder. Great, here comes the money, right? But like I said, when you're at the top of your game, you're still under the UFC rules. So once again, I'm listening to Jon Fitch break this all down. So here's the difference between the UFC and most of your other sports, right? In the UFC, when they say you're a world champion, you're not technically a world champion. You're a UFC champion, which means they own the belt. They own the contract that you're under with the belt, and you're under UFC rules, which means, you're not a champion to the world. You're just a champion to the UFC. But they say you're a world champion, but you're not really, right? You can't really go anywhere else and compete as a world champion now. You know what I'm saying? BJ Penn was able to get away back in the day, and a couple other fighters were able to get away back in the day. Then they changed it to where now you're on the lock and key of the UFC. Okay? So now they dictate every aspect of where you are in the rankings. Because you see the rankings is garbage in the UFC. Okay? So who you're going to fight is pretty much handpicked. Had nothing to do with the rankings. Okay? So they say you're supposed to fight 3 times a year. But how often do that happen? You hear Danny White say all the time, hey, I offered them fights. They just want to take it. Okay? If you're not making a whole bunch of money, how can you afford not to take fights? Okay? But like I said, if you're under shitty pay or you're injured, okay, they make you take fights. So Jon Fitch broke it down. So look what it costs to get into a fight camp, to take a fight, right? So if you're bringing in fighters and you're training at a high level, look how much it costs for any real fight camp. That's going to be way more than what you're making for your fight. So you normally go into a fight broke. So how can you not want to get back to another fight? You see all these fighters who are fighting, 3 and 4 and 5 times a year because they have no choice. They got to fight as often as they can to make money. You've been hearing fighters are starving in the UFC if you're not some of the big stars. Okay? That's by design. They keep you so desperate to fight and re-up so they can control what you do and what you can't do. So you remember when the Reebok deal came on, you couldn't have your own sponsors, and the Reebok, they made you wear their shit, right? So now, like I said, now they pay you a couple thousand here and there. The more you fight, the more you're supposed to make, blah, blah, blah. That's controlling all your money. It's like I said, I'm just paraphrasing from Jon Fitch. Okay? So what can you do when you're under that type of control? Right? You can't fight anywhere else because there's nowhere else to fight. The UFC bought up everybody. So where's your competition coming from? You see what I'm saying? All that competition is coming from the UFC. There's no other place to go. This is way before One came online. You know what I'm saying? This is way before Bellator became anything of significance. This is way before all that. When Strikeforce was doing good, then they bought Strikeforce, and after that, where else could you go? You see what I'm saying? You couldn't do anything else but fight for the UFC. So they completely had you under lock and key. Completely. Okay? So now the UFC starts to make some money and the notoriety is growing and, people are starting to pay attention, right? So now what they do, they get into the video game market to where they are using your likeness on video games. So now you playing UFC 5, UFC 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever number is on now, right? They're using your likeness. The video game is making all this money and you get none of it in the early years. You got none of it. So basically, they're slaving your likeness out and you get no benefits from it. And you had no say. You couldn't fight it, right? All before the lawsuit. You couldn't fight it. That's how it went. You got nothing. Then once the lawsuit kicked out, instead of paying you something, they shut you up, blah, blah, blah. Right? So here's where it got significantly crazy that I wasn't even thinking about until Fitch said it the way he said it, right? So he got into management, okay? And if you're a fighter and you have a manager, you're believing the manager is in your best interest. He wants the best for you. The way Fitch was talking about, the UFC had such a monopoly on the industry, even the managers had to play ball, right? And you end up signing these multiple deals that didn't really get you what you wanted because your manager was doing a negotiation. Why? Remember you seeing all these fighters just get rid of their managers. It's because they were getting shitty deals and getting locked into contracts, trusting their managers, but the managers were doing deals that benefit the manager in UFC, not the fighter. This is what Jon Fitch is saying, right? He could be completely off, but the way he say it makes sense. It makes effing sense. Okay, so now the UFC controls what you get paid when you get paid. They control who you fight, how you go up the rankings. They control if you get a title shot or not, right? Look at Tony Ferguson. 12 fight win streak, right? By the time he got to Khabib, but he got injured or whatever, missed weight, whatever. It never happened. He did all this body of work and never got over. Okay? Look how many of these fighters with 10 and 15 fight win streaks still can't get a title shot, right? Because they got the rankings on lock. It doesn't matter what you do in the rankings or who you beat. It's who the UFC wants you to fight. You see what I'm saying? So that was, they were controlling the likeness, okay, on one end. Now they're controlling your purse, right? How you make your money. So it took a minute for me to grasp what he was saying, but this is me paraphrasing in a nutshell, right? If you're under the UFC contract, okay, and you become a big star, or say you have the belt, you can't go out and try to market your brand out there in the world to see what kind of money you could truly make, right? Because if you got the belt, the UFC had a clause, once you got the belt, you're obligated to compete for that belt again. They have complete control of you having to compete for the UFC again if you win the belt, right? So you couldn't go anywhere else and test the market. They wouldn't let you do it. Why do you think the Francis Ngannou situation was such a big deal? Because he was able to fight out his contract, get free of the UFC, be able to join the PFL, and get a $10 million payday. Now you hear Chael Sonnen and all of them saying, hey, he would have made more money in the UFC, but then he'd have been in control too. Francis just wanted freedom. Like most of these other fighters, they just wanted freedom to see if they can make more money. That's why Jake Paul became a threat real fast, because all these fighters who were kind of finished in the UFC were have a whole new resurgence fighting in boxing. They were able to make more money in boxing than they were making in the UFC. It's a threat to the UFC. That's why the UFC is not letting it happen, right? They're locking down contracts. You can't get away. So they're controlling how much money you can actually make. Okay, now if you do something like a podcast or something like that, you making, ad revenue, that's different, right? But you're not going to be able to fight for any other promotion without Dana White getting his cut or not letting it happen at all. That's why Nate Diaz and Francis Ngannou have the biggest issue with the UFC is because they got away. You see what I'm saying? So there is no other way for you to make money if you're under the UFC. That's what the lawsuit is all about. They monopolized your ability to make money. You can only make what the UFC gives you. If they don't want to give you nothing, you ain't making no money. You can't renegotiate a contract unless it's in their best interest to do so. Okay? So where it really begins to blow up is the UFC, not the UFC, in the lawsuit, they were able to get fighters pay from some of the big names, okay? Because you got to understand, wasn't nobody hardly getting paid, right? They were saying your contract is your contract is your contract, right? So what they did, they had to prove the disparity in contracts, meaning that if you're a fighter and you fought these many times, you should be making this. But then you have a fighter who's fought less or never had a title to get paid more due to popularity or whatever the case may be. The contract is supposed to be the same for everybody, kind of, sort of, right? So now they've gotten the true pay receipts from Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey, Brock Lesnar, George St. Pierre, Anderson Silva, John Jones, CM Punk, Demetrius Johnson, BJ Penn, Tyron Woodley, Michael Bisping, right? So now the courts have, and the lawsuit has these payouts. So they get to say how much a fighter got paid and how much the UFC made off it. Okay? Compared to other sports. So they can show how big the disparity is. And I think I saw a clip on YouTube where they were talking about the UFC, for this fiscal year just made $600 million or something like that. Under their new branding, whatever they are, with TKO management, whatever they call, right? So a TKO group, whatever. And here is another thing that I found interesting. Once again, all this is from Jon Fitch. Now this is effing interesting. Think about this. So when the UFC was doing their thing, right? And they're with Zuffa and they had everything on lock and blah, blah, blah. When the lawsuit first kicked off and it started getting some traction, what did Zuffa do? They packaged it up, made it look good, right? And then they sold it for $4 billion, right? I'm like, okay, our business is meant to be sold, right? But according to Finch, they were getting out from under this lawsuit. So they sold it to Endeavor to let Endeavor handle all this noise, all this bad debt, all this bad paper that's getting ready to come. I'm like, well, shoot, that's smart. Get up out of it, right? And make some money to boot. So now Endeavor got it, did what they're doing, brought the WWF into it, whatever, right? Brought them into it, right? Put it under TKO, whatever management, because they know this lawsuit is coming. It's under a whole nother division. It ain't under UFC anymore. It's not under Zuffa. It's not even under Endeavor. It's under a whole nother name, right? TKO Management Group, or whatever the hell it's called, right? So they're trying to get out from under it too. Put it under another name. You see what I'm saying? So it's getting crazy. And they were talking about the payouts to fighters. So they're bringing in fighters. So when their lawsuit first came in, it was all about the likeness, right? The disparities of fighter likeness not being compensated for fighter likeness, right? Then when they got into the contracts and they showed the monopoly of fighters' pay, right? That's when it really ramped up. Excuse me, I fixed my mic. That's when it really ramped up. And now they brought in, oh, excuse me. All right. Got the TV on, dang it. So they brought in up to a couple hundred to maybe 1,000 fighters that fall under the UFC contracts from 2010 to 2017, somewhere around there. And how much the UFC made around that time, they say it could be anywhere from $800 million in payout to $1.6 billion in payout, all the way up to 4.6 or something like that billion dollars in payout to the fighters from that particular time frame. Can you imagine? That will finish the UFC. That will finish the UFC if this lawsuit gets those type of payouts. I can see why they put it under another umbrella. I'll do it too. And then you got the PFL and the UFC coming at you too. Right? It's getting heavy. It's getting heavy. So all these things are starting to pop off all at the same time. Now you got the Bud Light situation. It's all starting to make sense. They're trying to put as much distraction in your face, right? So you don't pay attention to this lawsuit. That's why they wanted the French and Ngannou fight, to stay in-house, something to turn you away from what's coming down, because this lawsuit is coming. It's coming. I advise you guys to listen to Jon Fitch talk about how all this breaks down, right? I'm not really doing it justice. I'm just saying from a fan's perspective, what we thought was a good thing turns around to be kind of dirty. Fitch said the UFC is a bigger crook than boxing, and that's saying something. Now, of course, Fitch is, he's been burnt, never had a chance to be a star, never had a chance to get what he wanted because they ain't like Fitch. And I remember that time. They used to give Jon Fitch the business. I remember that. So I get it. Where guys like, freaking Brock Lesnar and CM Punk can come in there and make a whole bunch of money and bounce where other UFC fighters can't. Look at Brock. Brock came in, made all that money, and was able to go back to the WWE. No problem at all, right? CM Punk was come in, make a huge payday, and get ready to bounce. No hamstring and no nothing. They had the freedom where other fighters didn't. See what I'm saying? Effed up when you see it like that. So that's all I got, man. This is going to be crazy. This is going to be crazy as hell. Like I said, that's just my take. When you think about it from the outside looking in, it's going to be crazy. It's going to be effing crazy. So I'm looking forward to see how this turns out. It's going to be crazy. All right, this is Coach D, doing what I'm doing, calling it like I see it, talking my share of shit. To hear from me again, peace out.